Chapters 64 and 65 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 64. Sir Edward Rolleston could not but feel his obligations to the Wardlaws, and when his daughter got better, he spoke warmly on the subject, and asked her to consider seriously whether she had not tried Arthur's affection sufficiently. "He does not complain to you, I know," said he, "but he feels it very hard that you should punish him for an act of injustice that has already so deeply afflicted him. He says he believes some fool or villain heard him say that £2,000 was to be borrowed between them, and went and imposed on Robert Penfold's credulity, meaning perhaps to call again after the note had been cashed, and get Arthur's share of the money." "But why did he not come forward?" "He declares he did not know when the trial was till a month after. And his father bears him out, says he was actually delirious, and his life in danger. I myself can testify that he was cut down just in this way when he heard the Proserpine was lost, and you on board her. Why not give him credit for the same genuine distress at young Penfold's misfortune? Come, Helen, is it fair to afflict and punish this gentleman for the misfortune of another, whom he never speaks of but with affection and pity? He says that if you would marry him at once, he thinks he should feel strong enough to throw himself into the case with you, and would spare neither money nor labor to clear Robert Penfold. But as it is, he says he feels so wretched and so tortured with jealousy that he can't cooperate warmly with you, though his conscience reproaches him every day. Poor young man! His is really a very hard case. For you promised him your hand before you ever saw Robert Penfold." "I did," said Helen, "but I did not say when. Let me have 1 year to my good work before I devote my whole life to Arthur." "Well, it will be a year wasted. Why postpone your marriage for that?" "I promised." "Yes, but he chose to fancy young Wardlaw as his enemy. You might relax that, now he tells you he will cooperate with you as your husband. Now, Helen, tell the truth. Is it a woman's work? Have you found it so? Will not Arthur do it better than you?" Helen, weakened already by days of suffering, began to cry and say, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" "If you have any doubt, my dear," said Sir Edward, "then think of what I owe to these Wardlaws." And with that he kissed her and left her in tears, and soon after sent Arthur himself up to plead his own cause. It was a fine summer afternoon. The long French casements, looking on the garden of the square, were open, and the balmy air came in and wooed the beautiful girl's cheek and just stirred her hair at times. Arthur Wardlaw came softly in and gazed at her as she lay. Her loveliness filled his heart and soul. He came and knelt by her sofa, and took her hand and kissed it, and his own eyes glistened with tenderness. He had one thing in his favor. He loved her. Her knowledge of this had more than once befriended him, and made her refuse to suspect him of any great ill. It befriended him now. She turned a look of angelic pity on him. "Poor Arthur," she said, "you and I are both unhappy." "But we shall be happy ere long, I hope," said Arthur. Helen shook her head. Then he patted her and coaxed her, and said he would be her servant, as well as a husband, and no wish of her heart should go ungratified. "None," said she, fixing her eyes on him. "Not one," said he, "upon my honor." Then he was so soft and persuasive, and alluded so delicately to her plighted faith, that she felt like a poor bird caught in a silken net. "Sir Edward is very good," said he. "He feels for me." At that moment a note was sent up. "Mr. Wardlaw is here, and has asked me when the marriage is to be. I can't tell him. I look like a fool." Helen sighed deeply, and had begun to gather those tears that weaken a woman. She glanced despairingly to and fro, and saw no escape. Then, heaven knows why or wherefore, probably with no clear design at all but a woman's weak desire to cause a momentary diversion, to put off the inevitable for 5 minutes, she said to Arthur, "Please give me that prayer book. Thank you. It is right you should know this. and she put Cooper's deposition and Welch's into his hands. He devoured them and started up in great indignation. "It is an abominable slander," said he. "We have lost £10,000 by the wreck of that ship, and Wiley's life was saved by a miracle as well as your own. It is a foul slander. I hurl it from me." And he made his words good by whirling the prayer book out of the window. Helen uttered a scream. "My mother's prayer book!" she cried. "Oh, I beg pardon," said he. "As well you may," said she. "Run and send George after it." "No, I'll go myself," said he. "Pray forgive me. You don't know what a terrible slander they have desecrated your prayer book with." He ran out and was a long time gone. He came back at last, looking terrified. "I can't find it," said he. "Somebody has carried it off. Oh, how unfortunate I am!" "Not find it," said Helen. "But it must be found." "Of course it must be found," said Arthur. "A pretty scandal to go into the hands of heaven knows who. I shall offer 20 guineas reward for it at once. I'll go down to the Times this moment. Was ever anything so unlucky?" "Yes, go at once," said Helen. "And I'll send the servants into the square. I don't want to say anything unkind, Arthur, but you ought not to have thrown my prayer book into the public street." "I know I ought not. I am ashamed of it myself." "Well, let me see the advertisement." "You shall. I have no doubt we shall recover it." Next morning the Times contained an advertisement offering 20 guineas for a prayer book lost in Hanover Square, and valuable not in itself, but as a relic of a deceased parent. In the afternoon Arthur called to know if anybody had brought the prayer book back. Helen shook her head sadly and said, "No." He seemed very sorry and so penitent that Helen said, "Do not despair, and if it is gone, why, I must remember you have forgiven me something, and I must forgive you." The footman came in. "If you please, miss, here is a woman wishes to speak to you. Says she has brought a prayer book." "Oh, show her up at once," cried Helen. Arthur turned away his head to hide a cynical smile. He had good reason for thinking it was not the one he had flung out of the window yesterday. A tall woman came in, wearing a thick veil that concealed her features. She entered on her business at once. "You lost a prayer book in this square yesterday, madam?" "Yes." "You offer 20 guineas reward for it?" "Yes." "Please to look at this one." Helen examined it, and said with joy it was hers. Arthur was thunderstruck. He could not believe his senses. "Let me look at it," said he. His eyes went at once to the writing. He turned as pale as death, and stood petrified. The woman took the prayer book out of his unresisting hand, and said, "You'll excuse me, sir, but it is a large reward, and gentlefolks sometimes go from their word when the article is found." Helen, who was delighted at getting back her book, and rather tickled at Arthur having to pay 20 guineas for losing it, burst out laughing, and said, "Give her the reward, Arthur. I am not going to pay for your misdeeds." "With all my heart," said Arthur, struggling for composure. He sat down to draw a cheque. "What name shall I put?" Edith Heskett." "2 T's?" "No, only one." "There." "Thank you, sir." She put the cheque into her purse, and brought the prayer book to Helen. "Lock it up at once," said she, in a voice so low that Arthur heard her murmur, but not the words. And she retired, leaving Helen staring with amazement, and Arthur in a cold perspiration. 65. When the Springbok weighed anchor and left the island, a solitary form was seen on Telegraph Hill. When she passed eastward out of sight of that point, a solitary figure was seen on the cliffs. When her course brought the island dead astern of her, a solitary figure stood on the east bluff of the island, and was the last object seen from the boat as she left those waters forever. What words can tell the sickening sorrow and utter desolation that possessed that yearning bosom? When the boat had carried Helen away was out of sight, he came back with uneven steps to the cave, and looked at all the familiar objects with stony eyes, and scarce recognized them, for the sunshine of her presence was there no more. He wandered to and fro in a heavy stupor, broken every now and then by sharp pangs of agony that almost made him scream. And so the poor bereaved creature wandered about all day. He could not eat, he could not sleep, his misery was more than he could bear. One day of desolation succeeded another. And what men say so hastily was true for once. His life was a burden. He dragged it about with him, he scarce knew how. He began to hate all the things he had loved while she was there. The beautiful cave, all glorious with pearl, that he had made for her, he could not enter it, the sight killed him, and she not there. He left Paradise Bay altogether at last, and anchored his boat in a nook of Seal Bay. And there he slept in general. But sometimes he would lie down wherever he happened to be, and sleep as long as he could. To him, to wake was a calamity, and when he did wake, it was always with a dire sense of reviving misery, and a deep sigh at the dark day he knew awaited him. His flesh wasted on his bones, and his clothes hung loosely about him. The sorrow of the mind reduced him almost to that miserable condition in which he had landed on the island. The dog and the seal were faithful to him, used to lie beside him, and often whimpered. Their minds, accustomed to communicate without the aid of speech, found out, heaven knows how, that he was in grief or in sickness. These two creatures, perhaps, saved his life or his reason. They came between his bereaved heart and utter solitude. Thus passed a month of wretchedness unspeakable. Then his grief took a less sullen form. He came back to Paradise Bay, and at sight of it burst into a passion of weeping. These were his first tears, and inaugurated a grief more tender than ever, but less akin to madness and despair. Now he used to go about and cry her name aloud, passionately, by night and day. "Oh, Helen! Helen!" And next his mind changed in one respect, and he clung to every reminiscence of her. Every morning he went round her haunts, and kissed every place where he had seen her put her hand. Only the cave he could not yet face. He tried, too. He went to the mouth of it again and again, and looked in. But go into it and face it, empty of her, he could not. He prayed often. One night he saw her in a dream. She bent a look of angelic pity on him, and said but these words, "Live in my cave," then vanished. Alone on an island in the vast Pacific, who can escape superstition? It fills the air. He took this communication as a command, and the next night he slept in the cave. But he entered it in the dark and left it before dawn. By degrees, however, he plucked up courage and faced it in daylight. But it was a sad trial. He came out crying bitterly after a few minutes. Still he persevered, because her image had bade him, and at last one evening he even lighted the lamp, and sat there looking at the glorious walls and roof his hapless love had made. Getting stronger by degrees, he searched about, and found little relics of her, a glove, a needle, a great hat she had made out of some large leaves. All these he wept over and cherished. But one day he found at the very back of the cave a relic that made him start as if a viper had stung his loving heart. It was a letter. He knew it in a moment. It had already caused him many a pang, but now it almost drove him mad. Arthur Wardlaw's letter. He recoiled from it, and let it lie. He went out of the cave and cursed his hard fate. But he came back. It was one of those horrible things a man abhors yet cannot keep away from. He took it up and dashed it down with rage many times, but it all ended in his lighting the lamp at night and torturing himself with every word of that loving letter. And she was going home to the writer of that letter, and he was left prisoner on the island. He cursed his generous folly, and writhed in agony at the thought. He raged with jealousy, so that his very grief was blunted for a time. He felt as if he must go mad. Then he prayed fervently, and at last, worn out with such fierce and contending emotions, he fell into a deep sleep, and did not wake till the sun was high in heaven. He woke, and the first thing he saw was the fatal letter lying at his feet in a narrow stream of sunshine that came peering in. He eyed it with horror. This, then, was to haunt him by night and day. He eyed it, then turned his face from it, but could not help eyeing it again. And at last certain words in this letter seemed to him to bear an affinity to another piece of writing that had also caused him a great woe. Memory by its subtle links connected these two enemies of his together. He eyed it still more keenly, and that impression became strengthened. He took the letter and looked at it close, and held it at arm's length, and devoured it. And the effect of this keen examination was very remarkable. It seemed to restore the man to energy and to something like hope. His eyes sparkled, and a triumphant "Ah!" burst from his bosom. He became once more a man of action. He rose and bathed, and walked rapidly to and fro upon the sands, working himself up to a daring enterprise. He took his saw into the jungle, and cut down a tree of a kind common enough there. It was wonderfully soft, and almost as light as cork. The wood of this was literally useless for any other purpose than that to which Penfold destined it. He cut a great many blocks of this wood, and drilled holes in them, and having hundreds of yards of good line, attached these quasi-corks to the gunwale, so as to make a lifeboat. This work took him several days, during which time an event occurred that encouraged him. One morning he saw about 1,000,000 birds very busy in the bay, and it proved to be a spermaceti whale come ashore. He went out to her directly with all his tools, for he wanted oil for his enterprise, and the seal oil was exhausted. When he got near the whale in his boat, he observed a harpoon sticking in the animal's back. He cut steps with his axe in the slippery carcass, and got up to it as well as he could, extracted it by cutting and pulling, and threw it down into his boat, but not till he had taken the precaution to stick a great piece of blubber on the barbed point. He then sawed and hacked under difficulties, being buffeted and bothered with thousands of birds so eager for slices, that it was as much as he could do to avoid the making of minced fowl. But, true to his gentle creed, he contrived to get 300 weight of blubber without downright killing any of these greedy competitors, though he buffeted some of them, and nearly knocked out what little sense they had. He came ashore with his blubber and harpoon, and when he came to examine the latter, he found that the name of the owner was cut deeply in the steel: Josh full o' love, J. Fernandez. This inscription had a great effect on Robert Penfold's mind. It seemed to bring the island of Juan Fernandez and humanity in general nearer to him. He boiled down the blubber, and put a barrel of oil on board his lifeboat. He had a ship's lantern to burn it in. He also pitched her bottom as far as he could get at it, and provisioned her for a long voyage, taking care to lash the water cask and beef cask to the forethwart and foremast in case of rough weather. When he had done all this, it occurred to him suddenly that, should he ever escape the winds and waves and get to England, he would then have to encounter difficulties and dangers of another class, and lose the battle by his poverty. "I play my stake now," said he. "I will throw no chance away." He reflected with great bitterness on the misery that want of money had already brought on him; and he vowed to reach England rich, or go to the bottom of the Pacific. This may seem a strange vow for a man to make on an unknown island; but Robert Penfold had a powerful understanding, sharpened by adversity, and his judgment told him truly that he possessed wealth on this island, both directly and indirectly. In the first place, knowledge is sometimes wealth, and the knowledge of this island was a thing he could sell to the American merchants on the coast of Chili, and with this view he put on board his boat specimens of the cassia and other woods, fruit, spices, pitch, guano, pink and red coral, pearl oysters, shells, cochineal, quartz, cotton, etc., etc. Then he took his chisel and struck all the larger pearls off the shells that lined Helen's cave. The walls and roof yielded 9 enormous pearls, 30 large ones, and a great many of the usual size. He made a pocket inside his waistcoat to hold the pearls safe. Then he took his spade and dug into the Spanish ship for treasure. But this was terrible work. The sand returned upon the spade and trebled his labor. The condition to which time and long submersion had reduced this ship and cargo was truly remarkable. Nothing to be seen of the deck but a thin brown streak that mingled with the sand in patches. Of the timbers nothing but the uprights, and of those the larger half eaten and dissolved. He dug 5 days and found nothing solid. On the 6th, being now at the bottom of the ship, he struck his spade against something hard and heavy. On inspection it looked like ore, but of what metal he could not tell. It was as black as a coal. He threw this on one side and found nothing more. But the next day he turned up a smaller fragment, which he took home and cleaned with lime juice. It came out bright in places like silver. This discovery threw light on the other. The piece of black ore, weighing about 7 pounds, was in reality silver coin, that a century of submersion had reduced to the very appearance it wore before it ever went into the furnace. He dug with fresh energy on this discovery, but found nothing more in the ship that day. Then it occurred to him to carry off a few hundredweight of pink coral. He got some fine specimens, and while he was at that work, he fell in with a piece that looked very solid at the root and unnaturally heavy. On a nearer examination this proved to be a foreign substance encrusted with coral. It had twined and twisted and curled over the thing in a most unheard-of way. Robert took it home, and by rubbing here and there with lemon juice, at last satisfied himself that this object was a silver box about the size of an octavo volume. It had no keyhole, had evidently been soldered up for greater security, and Robert was left to conjecture how it had come there. He connected it at once with the ship, and felt assured that some attempt had been made to save it. There it had lain by the side of the vessel all these years, but, falling clear of the sand, had been embraced by the growing coral, and was now a curiosity, if not a treasure. He would not break the coral, but put it on board his lifeboat just as it was. And now he dug no more. He thought he could sell the galleon as well as the island by sample, and he was impatient to be gone. He reproached himself, a little unjustly, for allowing a woman to undertake the task of clearing him. "To what annoyances and perhaps affronts have I exposed her?" said he. "No, it is a man's business to defend, not to be defended." To conclude, at high tide one fine afternoon he went on board with Ponto, and hoisting his foresail only, crossed the bay, ranging along the island till he reached the bluff. He got under this, and, by means of his compass and previous observations, set the boat's head exactly on the line the ducks used to take. Then he set his mainsail to, and stretched boldly out across the great Pacific Ocean. Time seems to wear out everything, even bad luck. It ran strong against Robert Penfold for years. But when it had struck its worst blow, and parted him and Helen Rolleston, it relaxed, and a tide of good luck set in, which, unfortunately, the broken-hearted man could not appreciate at the time. However, so it was. He wanted oil, and a whale came ashore. He wanted treasure, and the sea gave him a little back of all it had swallowed. And now he wanted fine weather, and the ocean for days and nights was like peach-colored glass, dimpled here and there, and soft westerly airs fanned him along by night and day. To be sure, he was on the true Pacific Ocean, at a period when it is really free from storms. Still, even for that latitude he had wonderful weather for 6 days. And on the 7th he fell in with a schooner, the skipper and crew of which looked over the bulwarks at him with wonder and cordiality, and casting out a rope astern, took him in tow. The skipper had been eyeing him with amazement for some hours through his telescope, but he was a man that had seen a great many strange things, and it was also a point of honor with him never to allow that he was astonished, or taken by surprise, or greatly moved. "Wall, stranger," said he, "what craft is that?" "The Helen." "Where d'ye hail from? Not that I'm curious." "From an unknown island." "Do tell. What, another? Is it anyways nigh?" "Not within 700 miles." "Jerusalem! Have you sailed all that in a cockle shell?" "Yes." "Why, what are ye? The Wandering Jew afloat, or the Ancient Mariner, or only a kinder Nautilus?" "I'm a landsman." "A landsman? Then so is Neptune." What is your name when you are ashore?" "Robert Penfold. The Reverend Robert Penfold." "The Reverend? Jerusalem!" "May I ask what is your name, sir?" "Wal, I reckon you may, stranger. I'm Joshua Fullalove from the States, at present located on the island of Juan Fernandez." "Joshua Fullalove? That is lucky. I've got something that belongs to you." He looked about and found the harpoon, and handed it up in a mighty straightforward, simple way. Joshua stared at him incredulously at first, but afterward with amazement. He handled the harpoon, and inquired where Robert had fallen in with it. Robert told him. "You're an honest man," said Fullalove. "You err. Come aboard." He was then pleased to congratulate himself on his strange luck in having drifted across an honest man in the middle of the ocean. "I've heerd," said he, "of an old chap as groped about all his life with a lantern and couldn't find one. Let's liquor." He had some celestial mixture or other made, including rum, mint, and snow from the Andes, and then began his interrogatories, again disclaiming curiosity at set intervals. "Whither bound, honest man?" "The coast of Chili." "What for?" "Trade." "D'ye buy or sell?" "Not that it is my business." "I wish to sell." "What's the merchandise?" "Knowledge and treasure." Fullalove scratched his head. "Hain't ye got a few conundrums to swap for gold dust as well?" Robert smiled faintly. The first time this 6 weeks. "I have to sell the knowledge of an island with rich products, and I have to sell the contents of a Spanish treasure ship that I found buried in the sand of that island." The Yankee's eyes glistened. "Wal," said he, "I do business in islands myself. I've leased this Juan Fernandez. But one of them is enough at a time. I'm monarch of all I survey. But then what I survey is a mixcellaneous bilin of Irish and Otaheitians that it's pison to be monarch of. And now them darned Irish has taken to converting the heathens to superstition and the worship of images, and breaks their heads if they won't. And the heathens are all smiles and sweetness and immorality. No, islands is no bait to me." "I never asked you," said Robert. "What I do ask you is to land me at Valparaiso. There I'll find a purchaser, and will pay you handsomely for your kindness." "That is fair," said Fullalove dryly. "What will you pay me?" "I'll show you," said Robert. He took out of his pocket the smaller conglomeration of Spanish coin, and put it into Fullalove's hand. "That," said he, "is silver coin I dug out of the galleon." Fullalove inspected it keenly, and trembled slightly. Robert then went lightly over the taffrail, and slid down the low rope into his boat. He held up the black mass we have described. "This is solid silver. I will give it you, and my best thanks, to land me at Valparaiso." "Heave it aboard," said the Yankee. Robert steadied himself and hove it on board. The Yankee caught it, heavy as it was, and subjected it to some chemical test directly. "Wal," said he, "that is a bargain. I'll land ye at Valparaiso for this. Jack, lay her head south-southeast and by east." Having given this order, he leaned over the taffrail and asked for more samples. Robert showed him the fruits, woods, and shells, and the pink coral, and bade him observe that the boat was ballasted with pearl oysters. He threw him up one and a bunch of pink coral. He then shinnied up the rope again, and the interrogatories recommenced. But this time he was questioned closely as to who he was, and how he came on the island, and the questions were so shrewd and penetrating that his fortitude gave way, and he cried out in anguish, "Man, man, do not torture me so! Oh, do not make me talk of my grief and my wrongs! They are more than I can bear." Fullalove forbore directly, and offered him a cigar. He took it, and it soothed him a little. It was long since he had smoked one. His agitation subsided, and a quiet tear or two rolled down his haggard cheek. The Yankee saw, and kept silence. But when the cigar was nearly smoked out, he said he was afraid Robert would not find a customer for his island, and what a pity Joshua Fullalove was cool on islands just now. "Oh," said Robert, "I know there are enterprising Americans on the coast who will give me money for what I have to sell." Fullalove was silent a minute. Then he got a piece of wood and a knife, and said with an air of resignation, "I reckon we'll have to deal." Need we say that to deal had been his eager desire from the first? He now began to whittle a peg, and awaited the attack. "What will you give me, sir?" "What, money down? And you got nothing to sell but chances? Why, there's an old cuss about that knows where the island is as well as you do." "Then of course you will treat with him," said Robert sadly. "Darned if I do," said the Yankee. "You are in trouble, and he is not, nor never will be till he dies, and then he'll get it hot, I calc'late. He is a thief and stole my harpoon. You are an honest man, and brought it back. I reckon I'll deal with you and not with that old cuss. Not by a jugful. But it must be on a percentage. You tell me the bearings of that there island, and I'll work it and pay 5% on the gross." "Would you mind throwing that piece of wood into the sea, Mr. Fullalove?" said Robert. "Can't be done nohow. I can't deal without whittlin'." "You mean you can't take an unfair advantage without it. Come on, Mr. Fullalove, let us cut this short. I am, as you say, an honest and most unfortunate man. Sir, I was falsely accused of a crime and banished my country. I can prove my innocence now, if I can but get home with a great deal of money. So much for me. You are a member of the vainest and most generous nation in the world." "Wal, now that's kind o' honey and vinegar mixed," said Fullalove. "Pretty good for a Britisher, though." "You are a man of that nation which in all the agonies and unparalleled expenses of civil war, smarting, too, under anonymous taunts from England, did yet send over a large sum to relieve the distresses of certain poor Englishmen who were indirect victims of that same calamity. The act, the time, the misery relieved, the taunts overlooked, prove your nation superior to all others in generosity. At least my reading, which is very large, affords no parallel to it, either in ancient or modern history. Mr. Fullalove, please to recollect that you are a member of that nation, and that I am very unhappy and helpless, and want money to undo cruel wrongs, but have no heart to chaffer much. Take the island and the treasures, and give me half the profits you make. Is not that fair?" Fullalove wore a rueful countenance. "Darn the critter," said he. "He'll take skin off my bones if I don't mind. Fust Britisher ever I met as had the sense to see that. 'Twas rather handsome, warn't it? Wal, human nature is deep. Every man you tackle in business larns you something. What with pickin' you out of the sea, and you givin' me back the harpoon the cuss stole, and your face like a young calf, when you are the cutest fox out, and you giving the great United States their due, I'm no more fit to deal than mashed potatoes. Now I cave, it is only for once. Next time don't you try to palaver me. Draw me a map of our island, Britisher, and mark where the Spaniard lies. I tell you I know her name, and the year she was lost in. Learned that at Lima one day. Kinder startled me, you did, when you showed me the coin out of her. Wal, there's my hand on half profit, and if I'm keen I'm squaw." Soon after this he led Robert to his cabin, and Robert drew a large map from his models; and Fullalove, being himself an excellent draughtsman, and provided with proper instruments, aided him to finish it. Next day they sighted Valparaiso, and hove to outside the port. All the specimens of insular wealth were put on board the schooner and secreted; for Fullalove's first move was to get a lease of the island from the Chilean government, and it was no part of his plan to trumpet the article he was going to buy. After a moment's hesitation he declined to take the £7 of silver. He gave as a reason that, having made a bargain which compelled him to go to Valparaiso at once, he did not feel like charging his partner a fancy price for towing his boat thither. At the same time he hinted that, after all this, the next customer would find him a very difficult Yankee to get the better of. With this understanding he gave Robert a draft for £80 on account of profits, and this enabled him to take a passage for England with all his belongings. He arrived at Southampton very soon after the events last related, and thence went to London, fully alive to the danger of his position. He had a friend in his long beard, but he dared not rely on that alone. Like a mole, he worked at night. End of chapter 64 and 65. Chapters 66 through 68 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 66. Helen asked Arthur Wardlaw why he was so surprised at the prayer book being brought back. Was it worth £20 to anyone except herself? Arthur looked keenly at her to see whether she intended more than met the ear, and then said he was rather surprised at the rapid effect of his advertisement, that was all. "Now you have got the book," said he, "I do hope you will erase that cruel slander on one whom you mean to honour with your hand." This proposal made Helen blush and feel very miserable. Of the obnoxious lines, some were written by Robert Penfold, and she had so little of his dear handwriting. "I feel you are right, Arthur," said she, "but you must give me time. Then they shall meet no eye but mine, and on our wedding day, of course, all memorials of one—" Tears completed the sentence. Arthur Wardlaw, raging with jealousy at the absent Penfold, as heretofore Penfold had raged at him, heaved a deep sigh and hurried away, while Helen was locking up the prayer book in her desk. By this means he retained Helen's pity. He went home directly, mounted to his bedroom, unlocked a safe, and plunged his hand into it. His hand encountered a book. He drew it out with a shiver and gazed at it with terror and amazement. It was the prayer book he had picked up in the square and locked up in that safe. Yet that very prayer book had been restored to Helen before his eyes, and was now locked up in her desk. He sat down with the book in his hand, and a great dread came over him. Hitherto candour and credulity only had been opposed to him, but now cunning had entered the field against him. A master hand was co-operating with Helen. Yet, strange to say, she seemed unconscious of that co-operation. Had Robert Penfold found his way home by some strange means? Was he watching over her in secret? He had the woman he loved watched day and night, but no Robert Penfold was detected. He puzzled his brain night and day, and at last he conceived a plan of deceit which is common enough in the East, where lying is one of the fine arts, but was new in this country, we believe, and we hope to heaven we shall not be the means of importing it. An old clerk of his father's, now superannuated and pensioned off, had a son upon the stage, in a very mean position. Once a year, however, and of course in the dog days, he had a kind of benefit at his suburban theatre. That is to say, the manager allowed him to sell tickets, and take half the price of them. He persuaded Arthur to take some, and even go to the theatre for an hour. The man played a little part of a pompous sneak, with some approach to nature. He seemed at home. Arthur found this man out, visited him at his own place. He was very poor, and mingled pomposity with obsequiousness, so that Arthur felt convinced he was to be bought body and soul, what there was of him. He sounded him accordingly, and the result was that the man agreed to perform a part for him. Arthur wrote it, and they rehearsed it together. As to the dialogue, that was so constructed that it could be varied considerably according to the cues, which could be foreseen to a certain extent; but not precisely, since they were to be given by Helen Rolleston, who was not in the secret. But while this plot was fermenting, other events happened, with rather a contrary tendency; and these will be more intelligible if we go back to Nancy Rouse's cottage, where indeed we have kept Joseph Wiley in an uncomfortable position a very long time. Mrs. James from next door was at last admitted into Nancy's kitchen, and her first word was, "I suppose you know what I'm come about, ma'am?" "Which it is to return me the saucepan you borrowed, no doubt," was Nancy's ingenuous reply. "No, ma'am. But I'll send my girl in with it, as soon as she have cleaned it, you may depend." "Thank ye. I shall be glad to see it again." "You're not afeard I shall steal it, I hope." "La, bless the woman! Don't fly out at a body like that. I can't afford to give away my saucepan. Saucepans is not in my head. Nor in your hand, neither. I've come about my lodger, a most respectable gentleman, which he have met with an accident. He did but go to put something away in the chimbley, which he is a curious gent, and has travelled a good deal, and learned the foreign customs, when his hand was caught in the brickwork somehows, and there he is hard and fast." "Do you know anything about this?" said Nancy to the mite severely. "No," said the mite, with a countenance of polished granite. "La, bless me!" said Nancy, with a sudden start. "Why, is she talking about the thief as you and I catched putting his hand through the wall into my room, and made him fast again the policeman comes round?" "Thief!" cried Mrs. James. "No more a thief than I am. Why, sure you wouldn't ever be so cruel. Oh dear, oh dear! Spite goes a far length. There, take and kill me, do, and then you'll be easy in your mind. Ah, little my poor father thought as ever I should come down to letting lodgings, and being maltreated this way. I am—" "Who is a maltreating of ye? Why, you're dreaming. Have a drop of gin. With them as takes the police to my lodger. It would choke me." "Well, have a drop, and we'll see about it." "You're very kind, ma'am, I'm sure. Heaven knows I need it. Here's wishing you a good husband, and toward burying all unkindness." "Which you means drownding of it." "Ah, you're never at a loss for a word, ma'am, and always in good spirits. But your troubles is to come. I'm a widdy. You will let me see what is the matter with my lodger, ma'am?" "Why not? We'll go and have a look at him." Accordingly, the three women and the mite proceeded to the little room. Nancy turned the gas on, and then they inspected the imprisoned hand. Mrs. James screamed with dismay, and Nancy asked her dryly whether she was to blame for seizing a hand which had committed a manifest trespass.
"You have got the rest of his body," said she, "but this here hand belongs to me. Lord, ma'am, what could he take out of your chimbley, without 'twas a handful of soot? Do pray let me loose him." "Not till I have said 2 words to him." "But how can you? He isn't here to speak to, only a morsel of him." "I can go into your house and speak to him." Mrs. James demurred to that, but Nancy stood firm. Mrs. James yielded. Nancy whispered her myrmidons, and in a few minutes was standing by the prisoner, a reverend person in dark spectacles and a grey beard, that created commiseration, or would have done so, but that this stroke of ill fortune had apparently fallen upon a great philosopher. He had contrived to get a seat under him, and was smoking a pipe with admirable sang-froid. At sight of Nancy, however, he made a slight motion, as if he would not object to follow his imprisoned hand through the party wall. It was only for a moment. The next he smoked imperturbably. "Well, sir," said Nancy, "I hopes you are comfortable." "Thank you, miss, yes. I'm at a double sheet anchor." "Why do you call me miss?" "I don't know. Because you are so young and pretty." "That will do. I only wanted to hear the sound of your voice, Joe Wiley." And with the words she snatched his wig off with one hand and his beard with the other, and revealed his true features to his astonished landlady. "There, mum," said she, "I wish you joy of your lodger." She tapped the chimney 3 times with the poker, and telling Mr. Wiley she had a few words to say to him in private, retired for the present. Mrs. James sat down and mourned the wickedness of mankind, the loss of her lodger, who would now go bodily next door instead of sending his hand, and the better days she had by iteration brought herself to believe she had seen. Wiley soon entered Nancy's house, and her first question was, "The £2,000, how did you get them?" "No matter how I got them," said Wiley sulkily. What have you done with them?" "Put them away." "That is all right. I'm blessed if I didn't think they were gone forever." "I wish they had never come. Ill-gotten money is a curse."
Then she taxed him with scuttling the Proserpine, and asked him whether that money had not been the bribe. But Joe was obdurate. "I never split on a friend," said he, "and you have nobody to blame but yourself. You wouldn't splice without £2,000. I loved you, and I got it how I could. D'ye think a poor fellow like me can make £2,000 in a voyage by hauling in ropes and tying true lovers' knots in the foretop?" Nancy had her answer ready, but this remembrance pricked her own conscience and paved the way to a reconciliation. Nancy had no high-flown notions. She loved money, but it must be got without palpable dishonesty. Per contra, she was not going to denounce her sweetheart, but then again she would not marry him so long as he differed with her about the meaning of the eighth commandment. This led to many arguments, some of them warm, some affectionate. And so we leave Mr. Wiley under the slow but salutary influence of love and unpretending probity. He continued to lodge next door. Nancy would only receive him as a visitor. 67. Helen had complained to Arthur of all people, that she was watched and followed. She even asked him whether that was not the act of some enemy. Arthur smiled and said, "Take my word for it, it is only some foolish admirer of your beauty. He wants to know your habits, in hopes of falling in with you. You had better let me go out with you for the next month or so. That sort of thing will soon die away." As a necessary consequence of this injudicious revelation, Helen was watched with greater skill and subtlety, and upon a plan well calculated to disarm suspicion. A spy watched the door, and by a signal unintelligible to any but his confederate, whom Helen could not possibly see, set the latter on her track. They kept this game up unobserved for several days, but learned nothing, for Helen was at a standstill. At last they got caught, and by a truly feminine stroke of observation. A showily dressed man peeped into a shop where Helen was buying gloves. With one glance of her woman's eye she recognized a large breastpin in the worst possible taste. Then her eye went up and recognized the features of her seedy follower, though he was now dressed up to the nine. She withdrew her eye directly, completed her purchase, and went home, brooding defence and vengeance. That evening she dined with a lady who had a large acquaintance with lawyers, and it so happened that Mr. Tolmash and Mr. Hennessy were both of the party. Now, when these gentlemen saw Helen in full costume, a queen in form as well as face, coroneted with her island pearls, environed with a halo of romance, and courted by women as well as men, they looked up to her with astonishment, and made up to her in a very different style from that in which they had received her visit. Tolmash she received coldly. He had defended Robert Penfold feebly, and she hated him for it. Hennessy she received graciously, and remembering Robert's precept to be supple as a woman, bewitched him. He was good-natured, able, and vain. By 11 o'clock she had enlisted him in her service. When she had conquered him she said slyly, "But I ought not to speak of these things to you except through a solicitor." "That is the general rule," said the learned counsel. "But in this case no dark body must come between me and the sun." In short, he entered into Penfold's case with such well-feigned warmth, to please the beauteous girl, that at last she took him by the horns and consulted. "I am followed," said she. "I have no doubt you are, and on a large scale. If there is room for another, I should be glad to join the train."
"Ha, ha! I'll save you the trouble. I'll meet you halfway. But, to be serious, I am watched, spied, and followed by some enemy to that good friend whose sacred cause we have undertaken. Forgive me for saying we."
"I am too proud of the companionship to let you off. We is the word."
"Then advise me what to do. I want to retaliate. I want to discover who is watching me, and why. Can you advise me? Will you?" The counsel reflected a moment, and Helen, who watched him, remarked the power that suddenly came into his countenance and brow. "You must watch the spies. I have influence in Scotland Yard, and will get it done for you.
If you went there yourself, they would cross-examine you and decline to interfere. I'll go myself for you and put it in a certain light. An able detective will call on you. Give him 10 guineas, and let him into your views in confidence. Then he will work the public machinery for you."
"Oh, Mr. Hennessy, how can I thank you?"
"By succeeding. I hate to fail. And now your cause is mine."
Next day, a man with a hooked nose, a keen black eye, and a solitary foible (mosaic) called on Helen Rolleston, and told her he was to take her instructions. She told him she was watched, and thought it was done to baffle a mission she had undertaken; but having got so far, she blushed and hesitated. "The more you tell me, miss, the more use I can be," said Mr. Burt. Thus encouraged, and also remembering Mr. Hennessy's advice, she gave Mr. Burt, as coldly as she could, an outline of Robert Penfold's case, and of the exertions she had made and the small result. Burt listened keenly and took a note or two, and when she had done he told her something in return. "Miss Rolleston," said he, "I am the officer that arrested Robert Penfold. It cost me a grinder that he knocked out." "Oh, dear," said Helen, "how unfortunate! Then I fear I cannot reckon on your services."
"Why not, miss? What, do you think I hold spite against a poor fellow for defending himself? Besides, Mr. Penfold wrote me a very proper note. Certainly for a parson the gent is a very quick hitter; but he wrote very square, said he hoped I would allow for the surprise and the agitation of an innocent man; sent me 2 guineas, too, and said he would make it 20, but he was poor as well as unfortunate. That letter has stuck in my gizzard ever since. Can't see the colour of felony in it. Your felon is never in a fault. And if he wears a good coat he isn't given to show fight."
"It was very improper of him to strike you," said Helen, "and very noble of you to forgive it. Make him still more ashamed of it. Lay him under a deep obligation."
"If he is innocent I'll try and prove it," said the detective. He then asked her if she had taken notes. She said she had a diary. He begged to see it. She felt inclined to withhold it because of the comments; but remembering that this was womanish, and that Robert's orders to her were to be manly on such occasions, she produced her diary. Mr. Burt read it very carefully, and told her it was a very promising case. "You have done a great deal more than you thought," he said. "You have netted the fish." 68.
"I netted the fish? What fish?"
"The man who forged the promissory note."
"Oh, Mr. Burt!"
"The same man that forged the newspaper extracts to deceive you forged the promissory note years ago, and the man who is setting spies on you is the man who forged those extracts. So we are sure to nail him. He is in the net, and very much to your credit. Leave the rest to me. I'll tell you more about it to-morrow. You must order your carriage at 1 o'clock to-morrow, and drive down to Scotland Yard. Go into the yard, and you will see me. Follow me without a word. When you go back, the other spies will be so frightened they will go off to their employer, and so we shall nail him."
Helen complied with these instructions strictly, and then returned home, leaving Mr. Burt to work. She had been home about half an hour when the servant brought her a message saying that a man wanted to speak to her.
"Admit him," said Helen.
"He is dressed very poor, miss." "Never mind. Send him to me."
She was afraid to reject anybody now, lest she might turn her back on information. A man presented himself in well-worn clothes, with a wash-leather face and close-shaven chin. A little of his forehead was also shaven. "Madam, my name is Hand." Helen started. "I have already had the honor of writing to you."
"Yes, sir," said Helen, eyeing him with fear and aversion.
"Madam, I am come—" He hesitated. "I am an unfortunate man, weighed down by remorse for a thoughtless act that has ruined an innocent man, and nearly cost my worthy employer his life. I come to expiate as far as in me lies. But let me be brief and hurry over the tale of shame. I was a clerk at Wardlaw's office. A bill broker called Adams was talking to me and my fellow clerks, and boasting that nobody could take him in with a feigned signature. Bets were laid. Our vanity was irritated by his pretension. It was my fortune to overhear my young master and his friend Robert Penfold speak about a loan of £2,000. In an evil hour I listened to the tempter, and wrote a forged note for that amount. I took it to Mr. Penfold. He presented it to Adams, and it was cashed. I intended, of course, to call next day and tell Mr. Penfold, and take him to Adams, and restore the money and get back the note. It was not due for 3 months. Alas! That very day it fell under suspicion. Mr. Penfold was arrested. My young master was struck down with illness at his friend's guilt, though he never could quite be got to believe it. And I, miserable coward, dared not tell the truth. Ever since that day I have been a miserable man. The other day I came into money, and left Wardlaw's service. But I carry my remorse with me. Madam, I am come to tell the truth. I dare not tell it to Mr. Wardlaw. I think he would kill me. But I will tell it to you, and you can tell it to him. Ay, tell it to all the world. Let my shame be as public as his whom I have injured so deeply, but heaven knows unintentionally. Mr. Hand sank all in a heap where he sat, and could say no more. Helen's flesh crawled at this confession, and at the sight of this reptile who owned that he had destroyed Robert Penfold in fear and cowardice. For a long time her wrath so overpowered all sense of pity that she sat trembling, and if eyes could kill, Mr. Hand would not have outlived his confession. At last she contrived to speak. She turned her head away not to see the wretch, and said sternly, "Are you prepared to make this statement on paper if called on?" Mr. Hand hesitated, but said, "Yes." "Then write down that Robert Penfold was innocent, and you are ready to prove it whenever you may be called upon." "Write that down?" said Hand. "Unless your penitence is feigned, you will." "Sooner than that should be added to my crime I will avow all." He wrote the few lines she required. "Now your address, that I may know where to find you at a moment's notice." He wrote, J. Hand, 11 Warwick Street, Pimlico. Helen then dismissed him, and wept bitterly. In that condition she was found by Arthur Wardlaw, who comforted her, and on hearing her report of Hand's confession, burst out into triumph, and reminded her he had always said Robert Penfold was innocent. "My father," said he, "must yield to this evidence, and we will lay it before the Secretary of State and get his pardon." "His pardon, when he is innocent?" "Oh, that is the form, the only form. The rest must be done by the warm reception of his friends. I, for one, who all these years have maintained his innocence, will be the first to welcome him to my house an honored guest. What am I saying? Can I? Dare I? Ought I? When my wife— Ah, I am more to be pitied than my poor friend is. My friend, my rival. Well, I leave it to you whether he can come into your husband's house." "Never. But at least I can send the Springbok out and bring him home. And that I will do without 1 day's delay." "Oh, Arthur," cried Helen, "you set me an example of unselfishness." "I do what I can," said Arthur. "I am no saint. I hope for a reward." Helen sighed. "What shall I do?" "Have pity on me, your faithful lover, and to whom your faith was plighted before ever you saw or knew my unhappy friend. What can I do or suffer more than I have done and suffered for you? My sweet Helen, have pity on me, and be my wife." "I will, some day." "Bless you, bless you. One effort more. What day?" "I can't. My heart is dead." "This day fortnight. Let me speak to your father. Let him name the day." As she made no reply, he kissed her hand devotedly, and did speak to her father. Sir Edward, meaning all for the best, said, "This day fortnight." End of chapter 66 through 68. Chapter 69 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 69. The next morning came the first wedding presents from the jubilant bridegroom, who was determined to advance step by step and give no breathing time. When Helen saw them laid out by her maid, she trembled at the consequences of not giving a plump negative to so brisk a wooer. The second post brought 2 letters, one of them from Mrs. Undercliff. The other contained no words, but only a pearl of uncommon size, and pear-shaped. Helen received this at first as another wedding present, and an attempt on Arthur's part to give her a pearl as large as those she had gathered on her dear island. But looking narrowly at the address, she saw it was not written by Arthur, and presently she was struck by the likeness of this pearl in shape to some of her own. She got out her pearls, laid them side by side, and began to be moved exceedingly. She had one of her instincts, and it set every fibre quivering with excitement. It was some time before she could take her eyes off the pearls, and it was with a trembling hand she opened Mrs. Undercliff's letter. That missive was not calculated to calm her. It ran thus: "My dear young lady, a person called here last night and supplied the clue. If you have the courage to know the truth, you have only to come here, and to bring your diary and all the letters you have received from any person or persons since you landed in England. I am yours obediently, Jane Undercliff." The courage to know the truth. This mysterious sentence affected Helen considerably. But her faith in Robert was too great to be shaken. She would not wait for the canonical hour at which young ladies go out, but put on her bonnet directly after breakfast. Early as she was, a visitor came before she could start: Mr. Burt, the detective. She received him in the library. Mr. Burt looked at her dress and her little bag, and said, "I'm very glad I made bold to call so early." "You have got information of importance to communicate to me?" "I think so, miss." And he took out his notebook. "The person you are watched by is Mr. Arthur Wardlaw." The girl stared at him. "Both spies report to him twice a day at his house in Russell Square." "Be careful, Mr. Burt. This is a serious thing to say, and may have serious consequences." "Well, miss, you told me you wanted to know the truth." "Of course I want to know the truth." "Then the truth is that you are watched by order of Mr. Wardlaw." Burt continued his report. "A shabby-like man called on you yesterday?" "Yes, it was Mr. Hand, Mr. Wardlaw's clerk. And oh, Mr. Burt, that wretched creature came and confessed the truth. It was he who forged the note, out of sport, and for a bet, and then was too cowardly to own it." She then detailed Hand's confession. "His penitence comes too late," said she, with a deep sigh. "It hasn't come yet," said Burt dryly. "Of course my lambs followed the man. He went first to his employer, and then he went home. His name is not Hand. He is not a clerk at all, but a little actor at the Corinthian saloon. Hand is in America. Went 3 months ago. I ascertained that from another quarter." "Oh, goodness!" cried Helen. "What a wretched world! I can't see my way a yard for stories." "How should you, miss? It is clear enough for all that. Mr. Wardlaw hired this actor to pass for Hand, and tell you a lie that he thought would please you." Helen put her hand to her brow and thought. But her candid soul got sadly in the way of her brain. "Mr. Burt," said she, "will you go with me to Mr. Undercliff, the expert?" "With pleasure, ma'am. But let me finish my report. Last night there was something new. Your house was watched by 6 persons. 2 were Wardlaw's, 3 were Burt's, but the odd man was there on his own hook, and my men could not make him out at all. But they think one of Wardlaw's men knew him, for he went off to Russell Square like the wind, and brought Mr. Wardlaw here in disguise. Now, miss, that is all, and shall I call a cab, and we'll hear Undercliff's tale?" The cab was called, and they went to Undercliff. On the way Helen brooded. But the detective eyed every man and everything on the road with the utmost keenness. Edward Undercliff was at work at lithographing. He received Helen cordially, nodded to Bert, and said she could not have a better assistant. He then laid his facsimile of the forged note on the table, with John Wardlaw's genuine writing and Penfold's endorsement. "Look at that, Mr. Bert." Bert inspected the papers keenly. "You know, Bert, I swore at Robert Penfold's trial that he never wrote that forged note." "I remember," said Bert. "The other day this lady instructed me to discover, if I could, who did write the forged note. But unfortunately the materials she gave me were not sufficient. But last night a young man dropped from the clouds that I made sure was an agent of yours, Miss Rolleston. Under that impression I was rather unguarded, and let him know how far we had got, and could get no further. 'I think I can help you,' says this young man, and puts a letter on the table. Well, Mr. Bert, a glance at that letter was enough for me. It was written by the man who forged the note." "A letter?" said Helen. "Yes. I'll put the letter by the side of the forged note, and if you have any eye for writing at all, you'll see at once that one hand wrote the forged note and this letter. I am also prepared to swear that the letter's signed hand are forgeries by the same person." He then coolly put upon the table the letter from Arthur Wardlaw that Helen had received on board the Proserpine, and was proceeding to point out the many points of resemblance between the letter and the document, when he was interrupted by a scream from Helen. "Ah!" she cried, "he is here! Only one man in the world could have brought that letter. I left it on the island. Robert is here. He gave you that letter." "You are right," said the expert. "And what a fool I must be! I have no eye except for handwriting. He had a beard. And such a beard!" "It is Robert!" cried Helen, in raptures. "He has come just in time." "In time to be arrested," said Bert. "Why, his time is not out. He'll get into trouble again." "Oh, heaven forbid!" cried Helen, and turned so faint that she had to be laid back on a chair and salts applied to her nostrils. She soon came to, and cried and trembled, but prepared to defend her Robert with all a woman's wit. Bert and Undercliff were conversing in a low voice, and Bert was saying he felt sure Wardlaw's spies had detected Robert Penfold, and that Robert would be arrested and put into prison as a runaway convict. "Go to Scotland Yard this minute, Mr. Bert," said Helen, eagerly. "What for?" "Why, you must take the commission to arrest him. You are our friend." Bert slapped his thigh with delight. "That is first rate, miss," said he. "I'll take the real felon first, you may depend. Now, Mr. Undercliff, write your report, and hand it to Miss Helen with facsimiles. It will do no harm if you make a declaration to the same effect before a magistrate. You, Miss Rolleston, keep yourself disengaged, and please don't go out. You will very likely hear from me again to-day." He drove off, and Helen, though still greatly agitated by Robert's danger and the sense of his presence, now sat down, trembling a little, and compared Arthur's letter with the forged document. The effect of this comparison was irresistible. The expert, however, asked her for some letter of Arthur's that had never passed through Robert Penfold's hands. She gave him the short note in which he used the very words Robert Penfold. He said he would make that note the basis of his report. While he was writing it, Mrs. Undercliff came in, and Helen told her all. She said, "I came to the same conclusion long ago, but when you said he was to be your husband—" "Ah," said Helen, "we women are poor creatures. We can always find some reason for running away from the truth. Now explain about the prayer book." "Well, miss, I felt sure he would steal it, so I made Ned produce a facsimile. And he did steal it. What you got back was your mother's prayer book.
Of course I took care of that." "Oh, Mrs. Undercliff," cried Helen, "do let me kiss you." Then they had a nice little cry together, and by the time they had done the report was ready in duplicate. "I'll declare this before a magistrate," said the expert, "and then I'll send it you." At 4:00 of this eventful day, Helen got a message from Bert to say that he had orders to arrest Robert Penfold, and that she must wear a mask, and ask Mr. Wardlaw to meet her at old Mr. Penfold's at 9:00. But she herself must be there at 8:30, without fail, and bring Undercliff's declaration and report with her, and the prayer book, etc. Accordingly, Helen went down to old Mr. Penfold's at 8:30, and was received by Nancy Rouse, and ushered into Mr. Penfold's room. That is to say, Nancy held the door open, and on her entering the room shut it sharply and ran downstairs. Helen entered the room. A man rose directly and came to her, but it was not Michael Penfold, it was Robert. A faint scream, a heavenly sigh, and her head was on his shoulder, and her arm round his neck, and both their hearts panting as they gazed, and then clung to each other, and then gazed again with love unutterable. After a while they got sufficient composure to sit down hand in hand, and compare notes. And Helen showed him their weapons of defense, the prayer book, the expert's report, etc. A discreet tap was heard at the door. It was Nancy Rouse. On being invited to enter, she came in and said, "Oh, Miss Helen, I've got a penitent outside, which he done it for love of me, and now he'll make a clean breast, and the fault was partly mine. Come in, Joe, and speak for yourself." On this Joe Wiley came in, hanging his head piteously. "She is right, sir," said he. "I'm come to ask your pardon and the lady's. Not as I ever meant you any harm, but to destroy the ship it was a bad act, and I've never throve since. Nance, she have got the money. I'll give it back to the underwriters. And if you and the lady will forgive a poor fellow that was tempted with love and money, why, I'll stand to the truth for you, though it's a bitter pill." "I forgive you," said Robert, "and I accept your offer to serve me." "And so do I," said Helen. "Indeed, it is not us you have wronged; but oh, I am glad, for Nancy's sake, that you repent." "Miss, I'll go through fire and water for you," said Wiley, lifting up his head. Here old Michael came in to say that Arthur Wardlaw was at the door with a policeman. "Show him in," said Robert. "Oh, no, Robert," said Helen. "He fills me with horror." "Show him in," said Robert, gently. "Sit down, all of you." Now Bert had not told Arthur who was in the house, so he came rather uneasy in his mind, but still expecting only to see Helen. Robert Penfold told Helen to face the door and the rest to sit back, and this arrangement had not been effected 1 second when Arthur came in, with a lover's look, and taking 2 steps into the room, saw the 3 men waiting to receive him. At sight of Penfold he started and turned pale as ashes, but recovering himself said, "My dearest Helen, this is indeed an unexpected pleasure. You will reconcile me to one whose worth and innocence I never doubted, and tell him I have had some little hand in clearing him." His effrontery was received in dead silence. This struck cold to his bones, and being naturally weak, he got violent. He said, "Allow me to send a message to my servant." He then tore a leaf out of his memorandum book, wrote on it, "Robert Penfold is here, arrest him directly, and take him away," and enclosing this in an envelope, sent it out to Bert by Nancy. Helen seated herself quietly and said, "Mr. Wardlaw, when did Mr. Hand go to America?" Arthur stammered out, "I don't know the exact date." 2 or 3 months ago?" "Yes." "Then the person you sent to me to tell me that falsehood was not Mr. Hand?" "I sent nobody." "Oh, for shame, for shame! Why have you set spies? Why did you make away with my prayer book, or what you thought was my prayer book? Here is my prayer book, that proves you had the Proserpine destroyed, and I should have lost my life but for another, whom you had done your best to destroy. Look Robert Penfold in the face, if you can.
Arthur's eyes began to waver. "I can," said he. "I never wronged him. I always lamented his misfortune." "You were not the cause?" "Never, so help me Heaven!" "Monster!" said Helen, turning away in contempt and horror. "Oh, that is it, is it?" said Arthur wildly. "You break faith with me for him? You insult me for him? I must bear anything from you, for I love you. But at least I will sweep him out of the path." He ran to the door, opened it, and there was Bert, listening. "Are you an officer?" "Yes." "Then arrest that man this moment. He is Robert Penfold, a convict returned before his time." Bert came into the room, locked the door, and put the key in his pocket. "Well, sir," said he to Robert Penfold, "I know you are a quick hitter. Don't let us have a row over it this time. If you have got anything to say, say it quiet and comfortable." "I will go with you on one condition," said Robert. "You must take the felon as well as the martyr. This is the felon," and he laid his hand on Arthur's shoulder, who cowered under the touch at first, but soon began to act violent indignation. "Take the ruffian at once," he cried. "What, before I hear what he has got to say?" "Would you listen to him against a merchant of the City of London, a man of unblemished reputation?" "Well, sir, you see we have got a hint that you were concerned in scuttling a ship, and that is a felony. So I think I'll just hear what he has got to say. You need not fear any man's tongue if you are innocent." "Sit down, if you please, and examine these documents," said Robert Penfold. "As to the scuttling of the ship, here is the deposition of 2 seamen, taken on their deathbed, and witnessed by Miss Rolleston and myself." "And that book he tried to steal," said Helen. Robert continued. "And here is Undercliff's facsimile of the forged note. Here are specimens of Arthur Wardlaw's handwriting, and here is Undercliff's report." The detective ran his eye hastily over the report, which we slightly condense. "On comparing the forged note with genuine specimens of John Wardlaw's handwriting, no less than 12 deviations from his habits of writing strike the eye; and every one of these 12 deviations is a deviation into a habit of Arthur Wardlaw, which is an amount of demonstration rarely attained in cases of forgery. 1. The capital L. Compare in London, forged note, with the same letter in London in Wardlaw's letter. 2. The capital D. Compare this letter in date with the same letter in Dearest. 3. The capital T. Compare it in To and in Tollemache. 4. The word to. See to pay in forged note and third line of letter. 5. Small o formed with a loop in the upstroke. 6. The manner of finishing the letter V. 7. Ditto the letter W. 8. The imperfect formation of the small a. This and the looped O run through the forged note and Arthur Wardlaw's letter, and are habits entirely foreign to the style of John Wardlaw. 9. See the th in connection. 10. Ditto the of in connection. 11. The incautious use of the Greek e. John Wardlaw never uses this e. Arthur Wardlaw never uses any other, apparently. The writer of the forged note began right, but at the word Robert Penfold glided insensibly into his Greek e, and maintained it to the end of the forgery. This looks as if he was in the habit of writing those 2 words. 12. Compare the words Robert Penfold in the forged document with the same words in the letter. The similarity is so striking that on these 2 words alone the writer could be identified beyond a doubt. 13. Great pains were taken with the signature, and it is like John Wardlaw's writing on the surface, but go below the surface, and it is all Arthur Wardlaw. The looped o, the small r, the l drooping below the d, the open a, are all Arthur Wardlaw's. The open loop of the final w is a still bolder deviation into A.W.'s own hand. The final flourish is a curious mistake. It is executed with skill and freedom, but the writer has made the lower line the thick one. Yet John Wardlaw never does this. How was the deviation caused? Examine the final flourish in Arthur Wardlaw's signature. It contains one stroke only, but then that stroke is a thick one. He thought he had only to prolong his own stroke and bring it round. He did this extremely well, but missed the deeper characteristic, the thick upper stroke. This is proof of a high character; and altogether I am prepared to testify upon oath that the writer of the letter to Miss Rolleston, who signs himself Arthur Wardlaw, is the person who forged the promissory note." To these 12 proofs one more was now added. Arthur Wardlaw rose, and with his knees knocking together, said, "Don't arrest him, Bert. Let him go." "Don't let him go," cried old Penfold. "A villain! I have got the number of the notes from Benson. I can prove he bribed this poor man to destroy the ship. Don't let him go. He has ruined my poor boy." At this Arthur Wardlaw began to shriek for mercy. "Oh, Mr. Penfold," said he, "you are a father and hate me. But think of my father. I'll say anything, do anything. I'll clear Robert Penfold at my own expense. I have lost her. She loathes me now. Have mercy on me, and let me leave the country." He cringed and crawled so that he disarmed anger and substituted contempt. "Aye," said Bert, "he don't hit like you, Mr. Penfold. This is a chap that ought to have been in Newgate long ago. But take my advice. Make him clear you on paper, and then let him go. I'll go downstairs a while. I mustn't take part in compounding a felony." "Oh, yes, Robert," said Helen, "for his father's sake." "Very well," said Robert. "Now then, reptile, take the pen, and write in your own hand if you can." He took the pen, and wrote to dictation: "I, Arthur Wardlaw, confess that I forged the promissory note for £2,000 and sent it to Robert Penfold, and that £1,400 of it was to be for my own use and to pay my Oxford debts. And I confess that I bribed Wiley to scuttle the ship Proserpine in order to cheat the underwriters." Penfold then turned to Wiley and asked him the true motive of this fraud. "Why, the gold was aboard the Shannon," said Wiley. "I played hanky-panky with the metals in White's store." "Put that down," said Penfold. "Now go on." "Make a clean breast," said Wiley. "I have. Say as how you cooked the Proserpine's log, and forged Hiram Hudson's writing." "And the newspaper extracts you sent me," said Helen, "and the letters from Mr. Hand." Arthur groaned. "Must I tell all that?" said he. "Every word, or be indicted," said Robert Penfold sternly. He wrote it all down, and then sat staring stupidly. And the next thing was, he gave a loud shriek, and fell on the floor in a fit. They sprinkled water over him, and Bert conveyed him home in a cab, advising him to leave the country, but at the same time promising him not to exasperate those he had wronged so deeply, but rather to moderate them if required. Then he gave Bert 50 guineas. Robert Penfold, at Helen's request, went with her to Mr. Hennessy, and with the proofs of Arthur's guilt and Robert's innocence; and he undertook that the matter should go in proper form before the Secretary of State. But somehow it transpired that the Proserpine had been scuttled, and several of the underwriters wrote to the Wardlaws to threaten proceedings. Wardlaw senior returned but one answer to these gentlemen: "Bring your proofs to me at my place of business next Monday at 12, and let me judge the case before you go elsewhere." "That is high and mighty," said one or two; but they conferred, and agreed to these terms, so high stood the old merchant's name. They came. They were received with stiff courtesy. The deposition of Cooper and Welch was produced, and Wiley, kept up to the mark by Nancy, told the truth and laid his £2,000 intact down on the table. "Now that is off my stomach," said he, "and I'm a man again." "Aye, and I'll marry you next week," said Nancy. "Well, gentlemen," said old Wardlaw, "my course seems very clear. I will undo the whole transaction, and return you your money less the premiums, but plus 5% interest." And this he did on the spot, for the firm was richer than ever. When they were gone, Robert Penfold came in and said, I hear, sir, you devote this day to repairing the wrongs done by your firm. What can you do for me?" He laid a copy of Arthur's confession before him. The old man winced a moment where he sat, and the iron passed through his soul. It was a long time before he could speak. At last he said, "This wrong is irreparable, I fear." Robert said nothing. Sore as his own heart was, he was not the one to strike a grand old man struggling so bravely against dishonour. Wardlaw senior touched his handbell. "Request Mr. Penfold to step this way." Michael Penfold came. "Gentlemen," said the old merchant, "the house of Wardlaw exists no more. It was built on honesty and cannot survive a fraud. Wardlaw and Son were partners at will. I had decided to dissolve that partnership, wind up the accounts and put up the shutters. But now, if you like, I will value the effects, and hand the business over to Penfold and Son, on easy terms. Robert Penfold has been accused of forging John Wardlaw's name. To prove this was a calumny, I put Penfold over my door instead of Wardlaw. The City of London will understand that, gentlemen, believe me." "Mr. Wardlaw," said Robert, "you are a just, a noble—" He could say no more. "Ah, sir," said Michael, "if the young gentleman had only been like you!" "Mention his name no more to me. His crime and his punishment have killed me." "Oh," said Robert hastily, "he shall not be punished, for your sake." "Not be punished? It is not in your hands to decide. God has punished him. He is insane." "Good heavens!" "Quite mad, quite mad. Gentlemen, I can no longer support this interview. Send me your solicitor's address. The deeds shall be prepared. I wish the new firm success. Probity is the road to it. Good day." He wound up the affairs, had his name and Arthur's painted out at his own expense, and directed the painters to paint the Penfolds in at theirs. Went home to Elmtrees, and died in 3 days. He died lamented and honoured, and Robert Penfold was much affected. He got it into his head that he had killed him with Arthur's confession, putting it before him so suddenly. "I have forgotten who said, 'Vengeance is mine,'" said Robert Penfold. The merchant priest left the office to be conducted by his father. He used the credit of the new firm to purchase a living in the Vale of Kent, and thither he retired, grateful to Providence, but not easy in his conscience. He now accused himself of having often distrusted God, and seen his fellow creatures in too dark a light. He turned toward religion and the care of souls. Past suffering enlightens a man, and makes him tender; and people soon began to walk and drive considerable distances to hear the new vicar. He had a lake with a peninsula, the shape of which he altered, at a great expense as soon as he came there. He wrote to Helen every day, and she to him. Neither could do anything con amore till the post came in. One afternoon, as he was preaching with great unction, he saw a long puritanical face looking up at him with a droll expression of amazement and half irony. The stranger called on him, and began at once. "Wal, parson, you are a buster, you air. You gin it us hot, you did. I'm darned if I ain't kinder ashamed to talk of this world's goods to a saint upon airth like you. But I never knowed a parson yet as couldn't collar the dollars." After this preamble he announced that he had got a lease of the island from Chili, dug a lot of silver plate out of the galleon, sold 10 tons of choice coral, and a shipload of cassia and cocoanuts. He had then disposed of his lease to a Californian company for a large sum; and his partner's share of net profits came to £17,247, 13 shillings 3½ pence, which sum he had paid to Michael for Robert, Penfold in drafts on bearing, at 30 days after sight. Robert shook his hand and thanked him sincerely for his ability and probity. He stayed that night at the vicarage, and by that means fell in with another acquaintance. General Rolleston and his daughter drove down to see the parsonage. Helen wanted to surprise Robert, and, as often happens, she surprised herself. She made him show her everything, and so he took her on to his peninsula. Lo, The edges of it had been cut and altered so that it presented a miniature copy of Godsend Island. As soon as she saw this, Helen turned round with a sudden cry of love. "Oh, Robert!" And the lovers were in each other's arms. "What could any other man ever be to me?" "And what could any other woman ever be to me?" They knew that before. But this miniature island made them speak out and say it. The wedding day was fixed before she left. Her Majesty pardoned this scholar, hero, and worthy the crime he had never committed. Nancy Rouse took the penitent Wiley without the £2,000. But old Penfold, who knew the whole story, lent the money at 3%. So the Wileys pay a ground rent of £60 a year for a property which, by Mrs. Wiley's industry and judgment, is worth at least £400. She pays this very cheerfully, and appeals to Joe whether that is not better than the other way. "Why, Joe," says she, "to a woman like me, that's afoot all day, 'tis worth £60 a year to be a good sleeper, and I shouldn't be that if I had wronged my neighbour." Arthur Wardlaw is in a private lunatic asylum, and is taken great care of. In his lucid intervals he suffers horrible distress of mind; but, though sad to see, these agonies furnish the one hope of his ultimate recovery. When not troubled by these returns of reason, he is contented enough. His favourite employment is to get Mr. Undercliff's facsimiles, and to write love letters to Helen Rolleston, which are duly deposited in the post office of the establishment. These letters are in the handwriting of Charles I, Paoli, Lord Bacon, Alexander Pope, Lord Chesterfield, Nelson, Lord Shaftesbury, Addison, the late Duke of Wellington, and so on. And, strange to say, the Greek E never appears in any of them. They are admirably like, though the matter is not always equally consistent with the characters of those personages. Helen Rolleston married Robert Penfold. On the wedding day, the presents were laid out, and among them there was a silver box encrusted with coral. Female curiosity demanded that this box should be opened. Helen objected, but her bridesmaids rebelled. The whole company sided with them, and Robert smiled a careless assent. A blacksmith and carpenter were both enlisted, and with infinite difficulty the poor box was riven open. Inside was another box, locked, but with no key. That was opened with comparative ease, and then handed to the bride. It contained nothing but papal indulgences, and rough stones, and fair throats were opened in some disappointment. A lady, however, of more experience, examined the contents, and said that in her opinion, many of them were uncut gems of great price. There was certainly a quantity of jaspers and bloodstones, and others of no value at all. "But look at these 2 pearl-shaped diamonds," said she. "Why, they are a little fortune. And oh!" The stone that struck this fair creature dumb was a rough ruby as big as a blackbird's egg, and of amazing depth and fire. "No lady in England," said she, "has a ruby to compare with this." The information proved correct. The box furnished Helen with diamonds and emeralds of great thickness and quality. But the huge ruby placed her on a level with sovereigns. She wears it now and then in London, but not often. It attracts too much attention, blazing on her fair forehead like a star, and eclipses everything. Well, what her ruby is among stones, she is among wives. And he is worthy of her. Through much injustice, suffering, danger, and trouble, they have passed to health, happiness, and peace, and that entire union of 2 noble hearts in loyal friendship and wedded love, which is the truest bliss this earth affords. The End of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. Recorded by Celine Major. I hope you've enjoyed it.